All right. Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to TFT, Tinfoil Talk. I'm your host, Chester C. Busby III, and today we're going to be talking about the Templars. Ooh, talk about a deep dive. There's a lot we can cover here today, and I'm sure we'll cover a lot of things. And we do hope, as usual, you folks over there in the chat will be involved in the conversation and offer us some of your opinions and maybe your conspiracy theories as well, because that's the whole point here. We want to delve into conspiracy theories in a fun way, right? We're not going to take anything too seriously. We're just having a bit of a pontification. How's that? Let's use that word. But I see Dave's in here, Joseph's in here, Nick too. And he says, tonight on TFT, Doug versus Ethan. Tell no drama for your mama stream. All right. That sounds funny. Yeah, we had Doug on yesterday, actually. It was a great conversation. Every time we talk to Doug, he's quite enlightening. Actually, he's got a lot of experience, and he's happy to share it. I'm always happy to have Doug on. We get some good guests like that sometimes that have some real insight, and we appreciate it a lot, of course.
And he's
Before
humble,
he is
very
humble.
humble.
He is
Yeah.
actually, yeah. And he doesn't have to be. I mean, he's in this indie revival that's going on. I'd say he's the most successful one, isn't he? I mean,
Looks
I
that
don't.
way.
It looks that way. Yeah. I mean, we've had a few people, Jamie Tyndall and of course Benny. They've had some really good
But
success, but it's not the same level.
but you're right because what he's giving you is a book you can put on your shelf.
Oh yeah, it's
Nobody else,
beautiful.
nobody else is even doing that. They're giving you, this is our comic.
Yeah, and I
Like no,
loved his reasoning for that. Yeah, yesterday, Todd. I thought that was a good answer.
yeah,
Yeah.
no, it was. He brought a lot of wisdom and sage advice. And it really changed my thinking.
Yeah, well, and I think he was also the humble point. I think you made quite clear is was important as well because he understands that not everybody in the indie revival can do what he did. He can actually take less profit on the back end because he is stable financially,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
there's a lot of dudes who come in who are not, and it's kind of like this big shot deal, and they're really putting all their cards on the table, and it's a fair point. I think it's a really good point. You know. But we did appreciate Doug coming in, of course. We always do. But we got our panel here. Let's say hello to them first. Let's start with Dinale. How you doing today, man?
I'm doing fantastic. Ready to hear what you guys are saying. And if people are interested, I have a project called The Immortal Mask. Join my newsletter at dinalescomics at gmail.com. The address is in the description below.
Yeah, awesome. And we're waiting with bated breath, Denali. So
Mhm.
give us information when you can, dude.
Yep.
But we also got George with us today. Hey, George.
Greetings, everybody. I am waiting with bated breath to hear all this thing about the Knights Templar.
Well, I'm
I
assuming
have.
you're going to be a font of information on it today.
Oh no, no, no. The only thing I knew was Indiana Jones and
Hmm. Indiana
That's a
Jones. Well,
that's a
And
great place
Sean
for knowledge.
Connery.
Yeah,
yeah, that's a great place. That's
I
perfect
recommend
knowledge
it.
there. Yeah. Well, it is interesting with the Indiana Jones, and I think DeWolf would agree. Indiana Jones was kind of doing a wink, wink to a couple of things. It was, because normally the that conspiracy side is going to be looking more at the Ark of the Covenant rather than the Holy Grail. It's interesting how things have really been kind of geared toward the Holy Grail with them a lot, and I think there's two reasons to it, which we'll get into later. But my main thinking on it, but one of the reasons I think is also coming out of the the Arthurian stories, which were written around the same time, right? But
Yeah, it's
right,
romanticized,
and,
which
yeah,
and
which is
also
romanticized,
fun.
yeah,
Chester,
yeah.
and also Chester, just for the fans out there,
Hmm.
if you white box me, you'll see a panel out of Joe King that I just finished a couple of weeks ago.
Yes, I see. There's a giant robot in space.
That's right.
Yes, I like the articulation on the hands.
It is quite detailed.
It is, you
Jeez.
know,
Quite detailed.
You're an interesting artist, George. You're kind of similar to Doug. Of course, I joke with Doug about it when he comes on. And says, "Hey, yeah, Doug's actually a pretty good artist." And of course, the point being, I have seen you and Doug uh, do really incredible art. I've seen your Superman; it's like a perfect rendition, right? And but you've chosen styles, comedic or artistic styles that aren't the most artistly of the choices. You know what I mean? But
Yeah.
you are a very good artist, actually, and so is Doug. It's very interesting from my point of view.
And my philosophy with the work that I do is that I like to break new ground. I like to be as novel as humanly possible.
Mhm.
So I never stick to the standards, boobs and gritty teeth and angry tropes and all that stuff. I I always look at what I've done before,
Mhm.
what's out there, and then I say, okay, well, certain things haven't been done yet. Okay, this is what I'm going to be doing now.
Well, there you go. There you go. All right then, and I think I said hi all already, but let me just make sure I don't forget. And hi, Todd.
Hey, how are you?
I am great,
Uh,
dude.
so I am familiar with the Indiana Jones aspect of all this, but
Okay.
there's nothing to do with the Templars in Highlander. I thought for sure there was some connection to the Templars in Highlander.
God, DeWolf, we're in trouble, man.
I don't. I think there should be. That would be
I
good.
think it would be good. It would be good, but yeah, no. Indiana Jones has come up several times. Is this the only place people know Templars from? Is Indiana Jones
No,
really?
I joke. I jest.
Cool.
Well, they know it from the video game Assassin's Creed.
Well, there you go. They
No,
they did make references. Yeah, but they weren't referenced in the very beginning, were they? I think that was something that came later, wasn't it?
No, they were from the very beginnings.
All right. Well, there you go.
Yeah, yeah.
But the Templars actually are over time very much a lot of conspiracy theory around the Templars. It's really interesting. Even before Dan Brown's book, I have to say it's accelerated quite a bit after his book, but even before that. There's always been this mystique around the Templars, and I'm kind of curious if by the end of the show, DeWolf, we can get to why. Why is there so much mystery around these people?
Oh, whee. Yeah, that I don't know about that. I'm not sure to understand the why means you have to understand all the people in society, and I think it's easier to understand the Templars before you're going to figure that out.
That's a fair point. But
Well,
you know,
I think I can draw parallels to current events. Think about the recent suicide of a certain billionaire, this fallen billionaire for a sex ring, underage sex ring.
yeah,
That happened to mysteriously commit suicide
right.
out of these circumstances. And think of this Templars organization that was very prominent, which was very powerful, which was a banker that lent a lot of money and had a lot of influence, almost overnight disappear without a trace.
Well, now that's interesting you mentioned that because I mean there were the Templars were bankers. This is for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, there's always been very distinct separation between the things that you're getting on here. Talking about the Illuminati, which was a real organization back in the 18th, 19th century, but and if they're still around, I have no idea. I'm sure there are many groups that have similar ideals and objectives. But the to for me to connect the Templars to that banking like Rothschilds and stuff like that, I really think they're very separate conversation. The Templars were bankers by default, not by choice, I think.
That's
But
that's right.
yeah,
Um, so let's set the stage here, though, for this aspect of banking because it comes up very often. So the Templars, after their inception, we can go into that at some point. They established the fact that they are in Jerusalem and that there's all these pilgrims that are coming from Europe to the Holy Land. And what would happen is you have to liquidate some of your assets, gather together some gold, some monies, and start your travel and your journey. And if anyone has been a tourist in a foreign land, you'll quickly find out that you become a target of people saying, hey, buy this or do this, or I want to scam you out of your money in some way, or just mug you outright. So the Templars just designed this idea up because they were supposed to help clear out bandits in the Holy Land and
Yeah.
keep the place safe and free. That's why they were originated in the first place. So this idea was, we're going to take your money. You can laugh about that part. We're going to take your money, and we're going to give you a chit, a code, a token, and it's going to be encoded. And this is where the code of the Templar comes into play. A code that they know of that says this person has deposited this much money. Give it back to this person here, right? It's basically like a debit card, if you will.
Mhm.
But instead of a barcode and a bunch of little numbers, right, it has a bunch of symbols on it. So they leave the Europe, the castle of the Templars that are back there. They go to the Holy Land, and you're able to, once you get there, go back to a Templar fort and say, this is my token, and I need to remove some money. So the Templars would take that, they'd give them some money, recode how much they had left, and then give that back to them again.
Right.
So
Yeah.
Which is
so you had a repository of all of these people's golden riches, back in Europe, as well as all this money in Jerusalem to hand it back out and create this concept.
Sure. And in opposition to that, with the Illuminati, we're seeing them come out of a more of a banking style of the Medici, right? Now, of course, my argument goes back a lot farther than that, but I'm not going to get into that today. But the Medici point of view is domination through banking, right? And that's kind of where your Illuminati angle is coming from, where as DeWolf has just explained to you, the Templars did it simply by necessity,
right,
and they became
but
super wealthy. They did.
right,
And
but
then
what,
yeah,
super well.
yeah.
Which 2 points come to mind with that, with what the wolf said. One, about lost technology. We always say that a lot of people have ideas that the past was this primitive, barbaric society, and that we're living at one of the greatest technological
Oh well.
advanced technological society. But then the wolf said they are using more or less an analog debit card system in the Holy Lands. Already
Basically,
that was in place.
yeah.
The second part was, by necessity, they became powerful, which drew the envious of, other powerful status quos that don't like new power coming encroaching into their territory.
By the
So
14th century, yeah, sure.
So with greed, with the political factors, with the money, you kind of have this already mystical conspiracy already brewing, that once they disappear for all intents and purpose, you have all these stories like what happened to the Templar. They couldn't, this powerful organization, this brotherhood, they just can't disappear just like that. You just can't break the idea of the Templar, that easily. So when they are they're disbanded, when they're, condemned by the Vatican, when no nation wants them, it becomes like a romantic mystery where, oh, what happens? And all these stories springs up. It's the perfect storm, basically.
It is interesting as well that you're going more toward the political side of things, and of course,
Mm-hmm.
we can't say the Templars didn't have political influence because they did. But for me, the other side of the Templars and the word powerful, we have to keep in mind something a lot of people don't talk about with the Templars. They're, in my opinion, we could sit and talk about fighting forces and capable ones. We can, even come down talking about the Apache and the Chiricahua, and we could talk about the Hussars and et cetera, and the incredible
Oh
fighting
yeah.
abilities they had. But actually, for me, three groups stand out through history: the Spartans, the Templars, and the Marines. Right? These are three legendary fighting forces that will bring hell to your enemies. Right? I mean, ridiculous levels of hell. It's a simple fact that in the intervening 1,000 years, we've never had any fighting force at that level until the modern day Marines. And it's very interesting that that doesn't come up in conversations very often, Dewolf.
Oh yeah, that's a good point. The original, nine knights, and then they became more and more. But especially when they were having to defend Jerusalem from Saladin's attacks, and those armies became solidified, and when they were retaking lands back again in Israel, and
Yeah,
also all the ones that came across North Africa and then ended up in Europe when the Moors entered Europe.
yeah,
The Templars had forts and holdouts there. A lot of times you would see and hear these battles of 30 or 100 versus 1,000.
sure.
And these knights, and I would read through my books. I've done lots of research on them. I'd read through them and I would go back and I'd say, wait a second, is it really saying what I think? Because
Mhm.
that is a huge disparity in numbers, but battle after battle, it constantly shows where they were fighting 10 to 1 and winning, if not coming to a stalemate.
Mhm. I think their ratio is actually higher than that. Of course, the modern day Marine has the highest ratio in history, which I think is currently sitting at 110 to one Marine, 110 other soldiers, which
Hmm.
is just a stupidly ridiculous number. The Templars and even back with the Spartans, they weren't that high a ratio, but it's higher than 10 to 1. It's much higher. I just don't know
It,
the number offhand.
like I said, even I had a hard time believing it, and I think it is. From what I remember, I was still astounded at how high it was.
Yeah, very impressive fighting force. Well, let me give a quick primer
Is
before we.
there?
Yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say, isn't there a point of where they chose these were territorial battles, and they chose the side of the people who were already in control of that territory to fight? So it wasn't like they fought these battles alone; they fought with the people of those territories.
Well, it's case by
To say
case,
that
really.
they fought, right, but to say that they fought 1,000 people with 30 people is not really accurate because a
It
lot of times
sometimes
they
is,
they
Todd.
were,
Actually, sometimes it is. Now, I
but
understand what
they
you're saying. You're not wrong, but no, we have examples of battles where literally, a handful of knights take out hundreds of people. Literally, yeah. They were
And
badass, dude.
they were combat strategists, weren't
Yeah,
they?
and they were very
I
capable.
mean,
They were fully clad in metal armor, and they dealt with that and fought in that in the heat of the Middle East too, which is impressive unto itself. Yeah, I get what you're saying, Todd, and I think that sometimes is true, but other times it's not, which is why they were so impressive as far as that goes. They were a devastating fighting force, dude.
They were the Abrams tank of
Yeah,
their day,
yeah,
and that's the difference that you have to understand. These knights, of course, they were there, and they decided to create the organization they did, and we can go over that at some point. But they then pulled their money and their resources, and they were usually nobles or like maybe the third sons. So they didn't actually have lands or things back home. So they were there doing that work, and but they did at least have some money coming from noble families. So they took that, they bought armor, good horses, and they had, of course, they brought over European horses designed to fight. Right, they weren't the strong, they weren't the fast and the Arabian horses. They were strong, war horse type stock.
they were
And then
prancers. Yeah, yeah,
they put on the barding and they put on the metal on the horse themselves. They were then clad, in metal or chain. And so when they charged forward um, with their broadswords and shields, you have to understand the other people were dressed in what you would dress, Bedouins. I mean, a lot of times they would have I think woven armor, if any
yes.
armor whatsoever, very lightweight, maybe short bows. So they weren't, of course, the big strong bows. Back once again, the long
No.
bows. Usually short bows, things that could fire from horseback even.
Hmm.
So
Well,
there were a lot more light troops that they were fighting against, and they would smash into these guys, and they were George used the term tacticians,
mhm,
and they drilled themselves constantly. Your whole job is making art, and so you draw and you draw and you draw until you get it done right. What they do is fight and train to fight and beat on each other, and then they get on their horses and they train their horses to fight and kick and bite in combat. And
mhm.
then they ride out close together, tight knit, formations, and slam into these other units. And it's devastating. And of course, back then, once you had shock and awe happen in a battle, a lot of times the battle was more of a rout instead of killing everyone, right?
It's true. Yeah, and there's another fair comparison here. When you get into Saladin, of course, and later when you talk about Richard, you have to take into account that one of the smart things Saladin did was a lot of his troops were in laminate armor, which gave them better protection, of course. Although in the end it wasn't an equal match, but it was better than what had been done. But you also have to
Yeah.
keep in mind that the what had been happening culturally for centuries before that were quite different. The Muslims, of course, what they had done since 600 AD, they've been going around the Middle East and as far as they could go, and basically go into little villages and say, "Join us or die." Now, most of the villages joined them. It's very few that actually fought against them. So their combat experience was actually quite limited. And when they did have combat, it was against peasants. Right? They didn't have many. There are some famous battles, of course, but in general, they didn't have this full-on combat experience. Whereas the Europeans had been fighting against each other for quite a while, and even, of course, we can bring into them fighting against some of the Muslim attacks. We could talk about Chinggis Khan on the eastern fronts, but they have been fighting against each other in some pretty serious ass wars over the centuries. So they were battle hardened already, and their technology. That's why their technology had become so advanced. Now I understand, so we could bring up the argument of Damascus steel and yada yada yada. Sure, but the Europeans adopted that immediately as soon as it came in, right? And of course, the level of armor, tactics, battlefield strategies, and weaponry were far more advanced simply because they had been in the thick of it for literally centuries.
Yeah, it's interesting you that you do bring that up. The Prior to the First Crusade, they had a lot of problems with these guys being violent. They were always
They did.
fighting, and there was a lull. And the conflict that was going on in Jerusalem at the time was a great excuse
Hmm.
for them to start the crusade because they wanted to. Now it was a double-edged sword. They wanted to get all these young, usually these nobles, young nobles, and who were fighting and bickering with one another, round them all up, say, hey, go to Israel, go to Jerusalem, and have this crusade and help take that land back.
That's true.
Well, in the meantime, you had um, thousands of other actual peasants hear this message, and because it included the idea that you would be fighting for your god and you become sinless through the process, many people wanted that, and so that's where you end up with the thousands of extra rabble that caused a lot of bloodshed and just
Hmm.
I mean riotous attacks later on when they
Sure.
do get over into the
Yep.
Holy Land.
Well,
So
and let me take it even farther than that, DeWolf, because it's a very interesting comparison you're making, actually. And we also have to keep in mind that the Norman invasions had just happened at that time, and there was, of course, the church wanted to calm that down because it was out of control what was going on. So that's a fair point. But another interesting point that you're making is the peasant having the opportunity to become a knight in essence, and many of them
yeah,
did. Right, and it's an interesting comparison to here in Japan because at a similar time in Japan, you could pick up a sword, become a champion, and become a noble. Right now, later when we got into Tokugawa in the Edo Jidai, which is around 1603, they shut that down, and only nobility could have title. right? They changed it, and we see in Europe after the Crusades, we saw this explosion of noble titles and noble houses, just tons of them, and all of that chaos led into the Reformation, right?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
It's not standing in obscurity unto itself. It's actually laid into history much later, well past the Templars' time.
Yeah. Yeah. 300 to 400 years, I believe.
Yeah, no, yeah,
Yeah.
serious. It's a serious, consequences for what the Crusades built, because we did get a lot of noble, minor, poor noble houses. It says it's kind of that little reference in in that movie called Knight's Tale, where he's able to get away with, because this is a funny little goofy movie, which it's fun though. But the kind of reference in there, he's able to get away with being this peasant country nobleman because there's so many of them everywhere, right? And that was a
Right. Yeah.
serious issue. Yeah.
Kingdom of Heaven. They show that where they knight they knight a
Oh
lot of
yeah,
people,
they
and
do.
they just knight them. You're a Templar. You're a Templar. You're a knight. You're a knight. And it's interesting because at one point, someone asks, "Wait, you're knighting them? Is that going to make him fight any better?"
Well,
Says, "Yes, it will."
yeah, sure it will. Yeah.
Because it gives him a reason to fight now. He's no longer just fighting as some little scum guy with nothing to show for it. Now he's fighting for a cause, and we always know that a man fighting for a cause is worth more than any one of them
Mhm.
fighting for money or some other vanity.
Well, it's also the placebo effect, right?
Uh, sort of,
Well,
right?
I
Yes,
think definitely. If you're being
yeah,
knighted and you're being brought up and God has touched you, and if you're a true believer, and a lot of those peasants were true believers, right? Then there's definitely a placebo effect coming in. It's kind of like with
I see
the
where you're using that term placebo. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, I mean, it's kind of like if you compare, like for instance, with the Boxer Revolution in China, or even in Vietnam, they were still doing it at that time. They had no faith. They had no belief in anything, right? Because Asia is a doesn't have a super strong ethos anyway. But so what they did with them is just drugged them up and throw them at the enemy. Right? They used drugs to, and that's where the 44 caliber pistol came from, was to deal with these drugged up, crazed people running at them because they needed to knock them down. Whereas the bullets before were just passing through, and if you didn't kill them instantly, they're still coming. That was what they did in Asia. But if you come over here over to the Americas, well, you had the red shirts and all those things like that, and the iron shirts that the Indians would believe that their gods were going to protect them. And they come at you like a crazy person. There's no drugs involved because the
yeah.
placebo effect made them believe it was true.
And that's what the Templars did.
That's
They
right.
they had that belief in a world where the Catholic Church held the reins of religion. You had to have the priest actually bless you. The Templars did not have that anymore because they got a papal bull that made all of them monks,
Yeah.
and so they could bless themselves. They were blessed by their own authority, and of course that goes into some of the reasons why they were killed off later. People didn't like this aspect. They were blessed on their own authority, and then so when they wrote out, they knew that they had that faith that they couldn't be, they either couldn't be killed, God was with them,
Hmm.
and so they fought. Yeah, they fought like fanatics. And of course Saladin realized too that when you capture them, you can't do anything with them. You can't change their mind. He would behead every single one of them, while other soldiers they would hold on to, and because they could try to get them, to change religions or join them, or whatever it was,
Uh-huh.
and convert. They get to convert, while the Templars, they knew they couldn't, so they'd have to just behead them all.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. And you mentioned, or someone here mentioned the Kingdom of Heaven, and I would suggest the director's cut over the original theatrical cut. But that movie does a really good job, I think, of showing the mindset of a Templar, actually. Day-to-day Templar. Not, of course, we're not. That's not touching on the conspiracy theories of them. It's just talking about the soldier. right? I do see a point in here from Joseph White. He says, "Were the Templars obsessed with relics from Jesus Christ?" Well, before we jump into that, because that's a very interesting conversation, let me give a quick primer because we haven't done that yet. Let me do this real quick, and then we'll let DeWolf answer that question for you. So I'm just going to come over here to the simple place, Wikipedia. Now we understand Wikipedia is not always completely accurate, and it's become extremely political recently. But nevertheless, it certainly serves our purposes. So it says here the Knights Templar, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. Now, the Temple
Hmm.
of Solomon, I think, needs to come into the conversation quite heavily, but we'll see where it goes. Also known as the Order of Solomon's Temple and the Knights Templar, or simply Templars. They were recognized, they were a Catholic military order, I believe, connected to the Jesuits, yeah? And they were recognized in 1139 by the papal bull. And of course, the order was founded in 1919 and was active until 1312, which of course got us into Black Friday and all that other such. This was perpetually suppressed by Pope Clement V. By the papal by the papal bull Vox in Excessio, which of course, is I'm assuming still in effect. The Templars became a favored charity throughout Christendom and grew. This is an interesting point. A favored charity throughout Christendom and grew rapidly in membership and power. They were prominent in Christian finances, which we already talked about a little bit. The Templar Knights, in their distinctive white mantles with a red cross, were among the most skilled fighting units of the Crusades. I'm not going to keep reading this. I'm not going to read this whole thing. I just want to give a quick little primer. They were put together by the Catholic Church in 1119, and of course they were called the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. And here I have a little bit of a look at the more traditional look at what they look like. This is I don't think this is actually old art, but it's certainly kind of looking like it's portraying itself as old art. But go ahead and answer that
So,
question, DeWolf.
so basically, what I'm hearing is
Huh?
these Templar Knights are the Blues Brothers of old age.
Huh? How so?
They're on a mission from God.
Oh God.
Yeah.
All right. But DeWolf, answer that question. Were the Templars obsessed with relics from Jesus Christ?
uh, yeah, yeah. I guess you could say that. Really, they were obsessed with relics of anything. That time frame, many people were obsessed with all kinds of relics.
Mhm.
Right? The shoot, what was the king of Roman Empire? His mother wanted the cross of Christ,
Oh,
and
she
that
wanted all kind of things, but yeah, she wanted pieces from the crucifixion tree. Yeah.
right, yeah, and so you have that happening everywhere. I mean, even today, you have the idea from the Shroud of Turin to the cross of Christ. Anything tangible
Mhm.
to try to connect to the story of Christ. People have been after.
Yeah, but I would say that I think this is something that always happens with religious groups, of course, but this did not reach its height though until the Middle Ages and all of the cathedral building that was going on through the Middle Ages, because each cathedral needed to have its relic. Right, and you would have people selling relics, and it became an extreme thing in the 14th, 15th, 16th century. I think relics came to their high zenith point, more so than at this point. Where the Templars, if they came across a holy relic, would they claim it? Of course they would. It's a religious, thing. But I think the question is, were they obsessed with Jesus? Was this all about Jesus? Is really what it is. Was it all about simply Jesus is God, and we have to destroy these filthy Muslims or Saracens
Oh,
at the time?
yeah, well, they'd be obsessed with Jesus too. That goes back to their fundamental, uh, belief system as Christians,
Mhm.
and that's an interesting point in that their version of Christianity actually was starting to change. I believe starting to change slightly from
Mm.
the actual Catholic Church because of what they had found
Yeah.
in Solomon's Temple. Because, well, actually, right from the beginning. So you had Bernard of Clairvaux, and he was a cousin, I believe, maybe of Hugh de Payne's, the first Grand Master. So once they started going and they requested this papal bull, it wasn't immediate, but Bernard of Clairvaux, he became one of the first Cistercian monk. If I'm saying that right.
Yes.
And this rule and this way of living your life always in a pious way,
Yeah.
right? He's well known for that. Well, he wrote a treatise called "In Praise of the New Knighthood,"
Hmm.
and he it was a just a huge, well, not a huge document, various chapters. I mean, it's a fairly long document,
It is. Yeah.
dictating what these guys were supposed to do, how they were supposed to live, how they lived,
Hmm.
that they no longer were fighting knights for glory or money. They were now fighting for the cause of religion itself.
Yeah.
And
They're
before
called
that, you didn't have that.
Cistercians, by the way, just to clarify.
Yes.
And
Thank you.
just to make a quick point, that book actually, or that treatise, is very similar, shockingly similar to the treatise put up by Musashi, The Five Rings.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So it because prior to this, you had knights that's all they did. I mean, they fought for uh, a lord. They fought for money. These guys are now fighting for God. They're fighting for the church directly, and so they then made them monks, right? And that's the huge difference because now you had monks who were usually the second born because there was so much land involved in religion. So you give your firstborn to being rulership, and if you could say the king, right? But
Hmm.
every lord's not a king, but he was the ruler of his lands. The secondborn went into the church. The thirdborn and down, they start getting a little bit dicey on what's going to happen to them. So with all these children, you had these nine knights get together. They said, and imagine that, right? Nine knights, and who said, we want to do something more. We want to be better than all this bloodshed, and we want to worship Jesus, worship Christ, and we want to become holy men ourselves. So when that happened, and they fused the two concepts together of a fighting man and a holy man, it it was um, completely a new thing, and no one could thought that you could do that. How could you fight and but you're a monk. Monks are supposed to be passive. Many of them were. So
Well,
so that being their religion, they would have they then of course Catholics they came from Catholic stock. That once again it derived from Jesus, and it derived from the blood of Jesus. All those things, and so yeah, they would want to get in touch with the relics, be at Solomon's Temple. And there was more than just Jesus, of course. There was the Old Testament. There was things about what happened there
mm,
and other legends, and that's where they started to, of course, dig for whatever they wanted to find or what they
sure.
thought was there.
Well, the papal bull came decades later, and I'm curious. Do you think that there was it more religious fervor or more politics that brought the Catholic Church to present the papal bull?
Whoa. I would first say it was religion. I think politics brought it to the foreground because at this point, not only you got nine knights, once they have this idea going because they were given this land and this Solomon's Temple, and they started digging, and it was something about 7 years that they were digging and they were building until they became a force, right? So several years later, did they actually become powerful?
Mm,
And
mm,
by that point, they took what money they had, what what battle prowess they had to defend their area. They had some success, and then more people started trickling in, right? Like any like any movement, even comic books, more people start trickling in, and it grows a little bit. And then they had a success, and they became slightly popular in that area. And then you had once they became that large of a force, now what do you do with them? Then it became slightly political.
Yeah.
So they started with faith. It turned political. They went to the Pope. The Pope said, "This is a noble idea. You guys are starting to help people, save people. Pilgrims are happy with what you're doing in a small area. Let me give you some cred, and you're now going to experience, a lot more success
Hmm.
and favor from people." Getting that papal bull and basically legitimizing them and taking them out from underneath the watching eyes of any other uh, Catholic priests, bishops, or whatnot. Now they
True.
can do their own thing,
Mm.
have their own autonomy to go out and do what they needed to do.
Well,
That's when they exploded and became so much more successful. And then, of course, politically, things changed even more so after that.
it's true. Now, I have a question here from Joseph White, but I do want to make a quick point before I ask it. One thing that I think you need to keep in mind that I don't know if we're making very clear, the Templars were incredibly popular with the people. I mean, they were superstars. So
Yeah.
much so that in the early 14th century, when the French king betrayed them and basically put out a and of course, I talk about the Vox papal bull that came out from the Catholic Church, and was in collusion with it. But so much so that we still carry the memory of their betrayal today. That's how popular they were, because the unlucky Friday the 13th has nothing to do with Jason Voorhees. It has to do with that was the day. It was a Friday, and it was the 13th when the King of France betrayed the Templars. Right. That's why and we still have it today. That shows you how the staying power of the Templars. They were beloved because they were actually charitable. They'd actually help people. So that I think that needs to be, we need to keep that in mind that they were popular with the people, although they obviously became unpopular with the people in authority. Not necessarily the French king, because his was just greed. He needed money, and then they had it. But of course, the fact that the Catholic Pope at the time backed him, that
Yeah.
that is
Remember,
political,
you
right?
you got Richard the Lionheart when he came into the Holy Land. They were very popular with him, right?
Oh yeah.
Kings and queens loved these guys for everything they were doing. It wasn't until after they were removed from the Holy Land where things got really bad. But in the meantime, there always were the detractors, and some of those were both in the church and without because of they had power, they had autonomy, they had money, and people wanted part of it.
Yeah, and another thing I mentioned Richard, which is interesting. Of course, he's called the Lion-Hearted, but I don't know if everyone understands where that comes from. Oh, that's coming from actually a proclamation that Saladin put out because his soldiers had engaged. He wasn't engaged directly, but his soldiers had engaged, and he saw it at a distance before he got it. He got in there. He actually kind of held back, but he had never seen such a thing on the battlefield as Richard charging into a bunch of soldiers and just laying them down. The actual brutal warrior that he was, and he said he was like a lion on the savannah, and it was the most impressive thing Saladin had ever seen. And this quote of the Lion of the Savannah is where he became Richard the Lionheart. Right?
Oh, yeah. So to answer the question though, I don't recall anything off the top of my head about them not being allowed to eat alone. But
Yeah, I don't know
when
either.
they did eat, they would eat together in a banquet hall, and they would eat quietly. And there was one at the head of the table, and he would read scriptures while
Hmm.
all of them ate
That's right.
in quiet. And that shows the pious nature of them. They also got up. They did vespers, which is basically getting up at 4 a.m. and they checked their horse, they checked their armor, they checked their weapons. Every day they did that at 4 o'clock, and then they prayed, and they prayed some more, and then of course they went back to bed. They got back up. They would gather together. They would gather silently. They would eat respectfully, and then they would go about their other chores, and they had constant chores. Like I said before, including training and fighting. They did not bathe very often, and I don't remember when they did, but that's because they shunned nudity, and so they and they didn't want to be, they didn't sleep alone because they made sure every man kept his hands to himself, or not to himself. Basically, you did not do anything. It kept accountability for everyone, and there was always a candle lit, so everybody could see that everybody was being very pure at
Right.
heart.
And of course, they also had the salt of Peter.
Oh, did they?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, well, certainly. But yeah, and Eric
Is that
says
a
the
joke?
Yeah, no, it wasn't a joke actually, but
Oh.
it's funny. Eric Hawkins said the orchestrated mass murder of the Templar. We're gonna get to it, dude. We're definitely gonna get to it. Now, Bullet says the Lion King is based on him. I didn't know that. Yeah, interesting. But now, of course, this brings us to another point that we should bring up. When and I think this is a fair angle when we're talking about when they mass marched into the Crusades, because I understand there, like DeWolf had just told you, there were a lot of activities and action already being taken before the Papal Bull came out and they were officially recognized, right? But when they did march the Crusade, the first Crusade down, they didn't go to Jerusalem; they went to Odessa. Right, and I think the reason they went to Odessa, this is an argued point, but I feel that it's a very strong point. And it also kind of brings us into what Dan Brown, and we already talked about this. I'm just going to recap it kind of quick for this conversation. The theory is they went into Odessa because what they were trying to do was to find a political solution to what was going on in Jerusalem specifically. Now, the Muslims themselves had been threatening the borders and attacking, and they were an issue. They were very much an issue. They've always been an issue since they became created, and they needed to deal with that issue. But Jerusalem was a major city, a religious center, and they wanted to find a political solution. And the idea was that, of course, back in the 70 AD wars, that were going on, where of course they call it the Jewish revolt, but really what was happening was there were four separate people, families that were vying for control of the throne of the Empire of Rome. Because the seat had been vacated, and they were seeing who's going to be the next emperor. And of course, one of those was Isus of Odessa, or Petra, and his mother had a direct royal bloodline connection to Rome. And and the Jewish state backed. Well, they weren't called the Jews at that time, but you know what I mean. The Jewish state backed Isus as their boy, right? And this was going on, and in the end he failed. And he was, we have evidence that he was actually crucified, but then taken down by you know, Joseph, of course, and then put in the prison up in Ireland that the Romans had built, the political prison place. Now, that has nothing to do with Yeshua. I'm not getting into Yeshua at all, right? We're talking about a king here. And what the Templars were trying to do was to try to going to Odessa to try to find the bloodline of Isus, because this would be a direct official diplomatic challenge to Jerusalem for the rulership of Jerusalem, right? Because they were, in the kingdom of heaven, you saw this king of Jerusalem guy. Well, who was he? Did he have any kind of claim to it? Well, no, he didn't really. It was very obscure. But this would have been a great, if they could find that bloodline, it would be a great use to a political tool for them. Now, of course, they failed completely, and then they marched into Jerusalem and just started fighting. It's not that simple, but you know what I mean. And of course, later, Dan Brown, when he was writing about Jesus, actually his whole writings is about Isus. It's not about Jesus, Yeshua at all. So I just want to make that kind of point, that's why they went into Odessa. They were thinking politically. It wasn't just raw, bloody combat. You know what I mean?
Truly, your intellect is dizzying.
Thank you.
I hold in my hand iocane powder.
hmm
Okay.
I have made
Um,
myself immune over years of small testings.
so now yeah, I know you're bringing forward this particular point to try to discuss on what they were there for and what that meant.
Well, it comes into the Solomon's Temple as well, dude.
But they dug at Solomon's temple.
Yes, they did, but I think there's a relation between the two, and it also is what
Oh,
brings us back to the creation of the Arthurian tales as well.
oh, okay.
Yeah, but anyway, go ahead.
Hmm.
The Solomon's Temple. I think that's what I was leading you into. So that was my
Oh,
handoff.
well, were
Yeah.
you okay?
Yes.
Well, the sheer fact they were there, and there's a constant, debate on what they found, right? Because
Hmm.
are they going to find riches and all of these things that were buried under Solomon's temple? And what is it? The Ark of the Covenant?
Yeah.
Is it the Holy Grail? Is it all these things? And there may have been some things that were some gold that was or valuables there,
Probably.
possible,
Yeah.
but I don't think it was anything any great amount, which gave them large overnight power, right? Because it wasn't really overnight. It was over several years,
Hmm.
as their power grew, and their power, of course, grew from within, really, from each man, not from something that they found, except for the fact of what they found. Now, see, during this time frame, they all learned Latin.
They
Now,
did.
knights
Yeah.
were generally illiterate, but the Knights Templar were not illiterate, especially the core group. And of course, as more and more come in, they may teach them, but that's going to take them some time. So, but it was a big difference change once again. These guys broke the mold across the board. Here they're learning to read and write. And when you have a guy who's a noble, who has power, authority, martial might, now he has intellectual might in a world that didn't exist, he becomes so much more powerful.
Hmm.
So they learned to read and write. And why was that important? I believe, and other researchers have come up with this theory, that they found things to read,
Yeah.
and that's the biggest power that they could possibly get a hold of, was things to read. And if it was religious in nature, then it would expand their minds, expand their knowledge in ways that the current religion of the days had not given to them.
Well, I was trying to separate the Holy Grail from the conversation, is what I was trying to do. And
Oh, okay. Because
yeah,
otherwise, yes, the Holy Grail is what people
yeah,
would
I
normally
would,
think of. You get the Holy Grail, you drink from it, you're now mighty and
yeah.
strong, and you have everlasting life, and you can go fight a bunch of Saracens.
Yeah, but
Um,
that conversation had more to do with politics than it did an actual object. But also to keep in mind, just a kind of a bit of interesting bit of information. Actually, the British Museum has a Templar study book in their collection, so they most definitely did educate their members. Yeah,
oh, right, yeah, yeah, yeah. So, I hope that I don't, dash anyone's great romantic ideas of the power of the Grail, the Ark, or anything else, but simply the greatest thing they could find was actual documents relating things such as the New Testament. If you were a man able to read and understand the New Testament in a world controlled by the Catholic Church at that time, where no one else could read and write. You had to go, you had to listen to what other people had to tell you. Um, then you now had power, because the New Testament comes right out and tells you everything from, John 3:16. And so if you had that and you're memorizing those concepts, you will go forward and fight, because the Saracens, on the other hand, they were fighting for someone else. They were truly the only people in that realm. I wouldn't say on Earth, because if as soon as I say on Earth, you're going to bring up some people in Japan or China that I never heard about. But they were the only people within that realm who were fighting for one cause, and that was the cause of God, and for no one else alone, because they read the documents themselves. I already said they read at while they were all eating, so they're telling them that that idea that of
hmm
course, so whoever believes within him has an everlasting life. Which, and I'm going to add on that three, paraphrase that 3:17 that comes afterwards, which is, because Jesus came not to condemn man but to save him. And um, when you have that, in that world, that is gold. That is power.
hmm But I also think that some of I agree with you. I think that what they found in the Solomon's Temple was not riches, but knowledge. But I think that one of the things they ran into that they hadn't known was some of the religious documentation around Mistra. I think this is a very important point because we see actual shifts in the Catholic Church in the coming centuries that did lean more toward going back to the old Mistra things. I think they found a lot of text about Mistra, and of course, we know that the Catholic Church simply was, of course, when we talk about Saul or Paul, he's the one that really created the church. It wasn't Jesus himself, and when they did what they did was they based it upon the religion of Mistra. That was like the foundational structure, and then they threw their own literature and dogma on top of it.
Well, explain that for the rest of us, Chester.
Well, Mistra was an ancient religion that's actually you could take it back as far going to the worship of Horus himself back in Egyptian times. But Mistra it was a very long running religious practice that well the easiest way to explain it is just think of Christianity and replace Jesus with Horus because otherwise it's incredibly similar, and that's what they did. The creators of the Catholic Church, and of course, this is coming to complete fruition with Constantine. They just basically took Mistra and just kind of pasted the teachings of Yeshua on top of it. Right, so the structure itself is Mistracism, and I think they didn't know that at the time. I think that knowledge had been basically lost, at least to the non-deep political members and controllers of the Catholic Church, at least. And when these Templars ran in and started reading it and seeing the comparisons and started understanding what they were reading, I think this was a bit of knowledge they took with them.
I'm going to meet you in the middle on that because at that time, right, most of everything came from the Eastern Orthodox, and
Mhm.
where they broke off with the Catholic Church, and everything at that point was Greek Roman derivative and become the Westernization of the Catholic Church. These guys, what they got would have been a more pure Old Testament documents,
Mhm.
and of course, Jews came from Egypt
That's
and
right.
all of that other Egyptian and even Babylonian concepts that are in the Old Testament. These guys are starting to learn, and which is different. It's just radically different from the Catholics. So I'm not going to say, I wouldn't say that it included the Mithra stuff and the Horus stuff, but it would read and it would seem and look, and the artwork that they'd find would look radically different. It would look Egyptian, and that would of
It
course
would.
inspire them to be slightly different
Yeah.
than the Catholics, which as they become different from the Catholics using these ideas, because you have to remember they're no longer communicating with the Catholics on a continual basis. They're skipping over everybody and going straight to the Pope.
That's right.
And
Yeah.
so, right, I mean, there's only one other person that communicates with them in the Catholic faith still, and that's the Pope. And he keeps telling everybody else and believing that yeah, they're still good men of God. And
Well,
so, but they start this tangent going off to the side over the next couple of 100 years, and that creates division later on.
Well, I think the reason I mentioned it is because we have to understand who Solomon was, right? Hold on a second. Sorry about that. My dog has something to say. But Solomon, a lot of people, especially modern day Christians, they really misunderstand who Solomon is. They completely misunderstand who Solomon is. He is not this. He's not this Jewish, separated Jewish leader. He was Egyptian. He was a Hyksos king. He was one of the dragon lords. He was an Egyptian king actually, and his power and his the respect for him was immense. But when the when the Hyksos took over the control of Egypt, he is simply in that line. All right, and then of
I
course
don't know
we
what
did
you're talking about.
well because I don't think people understand where the Jews come from. You have really two separations when you talk about the Exodus, right? There's actually two, right? There is the exodus of the shepherd kings, right? They of course were called shepherd kings because from their earlier times they were coming out of a shepherdly system probably, but mainly they used the shepherd's crook as their symbol for their god, and these guys were not really what we would consider Hebrew, right? But they were making it. They tried for a coup in Egypt and they failed, and they ended up getting pushed out. So you have that piece of it, right? But they're called the Shepherd Kings, and it kind of mingles with and interacts with the stories of Moses, right? But then the other Exodus is the Exodus of or the exile of Akhenaten, who is Moses, right? And these two things become confused, just like Isus and Yeshua get confused over time. And Solomon was not a per se Jewish king. He was a Hyksosian king. The Hyksos or we simply call them Jews today. They actually came in, took control of Egypt. They were not slaves. This is nonsense. They were the kings and controllers of Egypt. Now they weren't the happy kings, because a lot of the people, especially the temple, hated them. But they had no choice but to capitulate, and they were in charge for quite a while. And the deal was very simple. Okay, the people of Egypt will control the temple, and you control the government, and that lasted for a long time. And of course, during Solomon's time, he was highly respected. And it wasn't until Akhenaten and his arrogance where he decided, no, I'm going to take everything because I'm the king. How dare you? Right? And it's really interesting to me how today Moses is this incredible symbol in Christianity, when in truth he was a villain, right? And when Akhenaten took them to the northeast and ended up establishing Jerusalem on the previous lands they had controlled, actually retaking those lands, the Hyksosian lands, this is where the nations of Israel and Judea come from. And actually, the
What?
reason why they were separated was because of the disagreements in the politically. And we also had a further spreading of them into Persia as well as Greece. The founding of Greece itself is coming out of the Hyksosian kings, dude.
Eject.
Okay.
Eject.
You're going. Wait. Let's bring it back to town. To the
What are you talking
Templars.
about? This is all directly related, because you need
Mhm.
to understand who Solomon is. Once you understand who Solomon is, and then the Templars found his temple and started digging into it, you start understanding that it's not looks like Egyptian, it is Egyptian. And that explains a lot, I think. And it also brings up the conversation we probably will run into when we get into talking about the modern day Masons and where do they come from.
Do they walk like Egyptians?
I think they do.
Okay.
Oh boy, you're gonna go with. Oh no, I'm gonna stop there. I'm gonna stop there. I know where you were going there. Mm,
Okay.
You know what I mean?
yeah.
Okay.
It does
So
change the
where does that
conversation,
leave
dude.
us off with then, Chester?
It leaves us with the idea that what the Templars more than likely find was knowledge, which you and I both agree upon, but the knowledge they found was of knowledge of Egypt. And this also led into later where they were betrayed. Then, of course, a lot of them escaped to up to Scotland, and we also know that I'll let you handle that conversation, but them going to the Americas as well. But of course, the Scottish Rite being created, and of course, from the Scottish Rite, we're getting modern day Masons. And of course, one of the things about the Masons is a lot of their secret ancient knowledge is actually Egyptian. And there's huge amounts of mysticism with Egyptian mysticism, Mistra mysticism, as well as some of the Saturnal mysticism as well. That's in modern day Masonry.
Well, of course, Egyptian goes back further a little bit back to Babylonian. Babylonian then, of course, would have gone back further towards the original people that were pre-flood.
So this is before Babylon, dude.
And
What I'm talking about is before Babylon. It's before the Babylonian imprisonment of the Jews.
right, yeah, pre-Babel, the Babel of Babylon.
Yeah.
Yes, Babel. That
No,
would
well,
be
that's much earlier. But anyway.
that'd be pre-Egyptian, and of course, those people are derived from the earlier peoples. So everything has derived back from God's original people, God's original plan pre-flood, flowing down through Egypt back up into Israel to be found by the Templars.
Yes. So my
Which
yes.
leads us then, I guess that then leads us to the point of what happens after Jerusalem falls. They lose all their cracks, which are castles, they call them,
Mhm.
and from Jerusalem onto Antioch, and you get them going back to being pushed back towards Europe. And of course, being that this at this point, not only do they have the charitable money, they've got the money and riches that they are able to sack, right, and loot from winning battles, from kings and queens. Once again, they also are giving them gold. I believe they take a tithe. You have to imagine at this point, though, when you have these castles, you also have people. You've got your own butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers.
Mhm.
Um, Everyone that requires to now run a castle, run lands, because that's what they have at this point. They're being affected by the Templars, and this will come into play, much later over of the next 100 years, as these people see these guys doing their things. And it's interesting that you bring up this idea of the Egyptian, because they're not known for being worshiping Egyptian deities, save one that I know of.
Mhm.
It always goes back to Christianity.
Sure.
And of course, the one time they were accused of worshiping something else, it was by the Philip the Fair of France. He wanted to be a Templar. Matter of fact, Richard the Lionheart was going to be a Templar. He was kind of an honorary Templar, but anyone that joins the Templars, that's why these guys are poor Knights of Christ. They have to give up everything.
Sure.
They personally become poor, while the organization at large, of course, ends up with everything you have, to be distributed kind of in a communist or socialist type society. Everybody takes care of everybody.
Sure.
Um, in
Well,
a
you know I'm going
pure
to circle back, right?
Christian. Okay, you're going to circle back
You know
to
I
what
am.
part?
Well, let's ask the question: why did they end up in Scotland? Why is that ended up
Oh well,
becoming
we
their
have to we have to
refuge?
talk about Philip the Fair then, of course,
Yes,
because
please.
so Philip the Fair wanted to become involved. He had debts, he had war, he wanted to join them, he wanted to take out a loan. They said no. He wanted their money. He wanted their power, their influence. They said no, you're not the right kind of guy, because they take in at that point. There was tests you had to go through, and they kept things secret amongst themselves, much like any company does today. You
Mhm.
keep your bank records secret. Trump has kept his IRS, records secret. Everybody keeps their secrets, especially when they deal with businesses and finance stuff, right? And they had this code that they used as well, and they had to keep that secret. Got out, it would kind of harm the whole organization. So with all this secrecy, people then started saying, well, what's behind those closed doors? And that led to some of the problems, and why do they have all this power and mightiness of even of heart and valor? So that leads to jealousy. The human condition is to be skeptical and have YouTube shows talking about conspiracy. So that's what was going on. You had Philip the Fair getting on his own, castle stream, telling people that this is bad, and getting the Pope involved,
Mhm.
saying that these guys were bad. And so, yeah, he went to go have them arrested, and stuff like that. Except they knew it was coming.
Yeah, they did.
You know, some of them stayed behind, um, and Jacques Gamelet and some of the other the last Grandmaster and several of the other knights, they stayed behind. They confronted. They took them away and were betrayed, much like another reenactment of Jesus Christ, right?
In a way,
So,
yeah.
but then you had, I think it was something like 1,400 sailing vessels that were all Templar that left that night from the ports of France. You
Yes.
had all of these knights gone, right? They fled off into the woods, so to speak, and that's where we end up seeing later on. you have them show up in Scotland, and that's a very interesting story of why they ended up in Scotland, about what was happening with the king there. Um, so
Yeah, but see, I
there were, of
think
course,
the conversation about with the king that you're talking about and all of those things that went up in Scotland, I think they're extremely important to the story of the Templar, dude. Because I don't think it's simply them finding a favorable king that would support and hide them. I think the things in Scotland had been going on a lot from a century before this, maybe even more. Because what I think was going on in Scotland is I think if you look at their readings and you see some of the ideas that came out about that, I think they found another temple in Scotland, dude. Because you have to keep in mind, one again, like I'm saying, Solomon is coming out of the Hyksos kings, right? And of course, who is Akhenaten's daughter? Well, her name is Scotia, and she was sent for her protection far to the northern, controlled area, so she'd be safe. And of course, she stayed there. She became popular with the people. She helped them. She built a lot of structures because they had knowledge, right? And of course, they named their country after her, Scotland, right? I do believe that there's a direct. They either found a temple or they were looking for one. And I think this is why Scotland had been a focal point. And then when they retreated back up there, because they'd already created a home base for themselves there, because they were looking for holy relic, as in a temple of Solomon built for his daughter, or
yeah. Well, and
an ancestor, right?
well, by this point, they were also looking for a lot more. They were looking for this new land because they had found
Oh, that's true.
ancient
Yeah.
maps, and the ancient maps showed Greenland, and the Americas on it as well.
hmm No,
And they
that's another. We should get into that conversation because I think it's an important one. But just to finish it up, we also just my point on it. We also know coming out of the money and the Scottish connection eventually came into one of the Templar families, which still exists into this day. Of course, was the Bruce family, and of course, I don't know if you guys know this, but every single solitary president we've had in America is either directly or somehow indirectly related to the Bruce family of Scotland. All of them, even
yeah.
Obama, right? So I'm just saying that Templar connection is not ended; it's still there.
Yes, yeah, the area of the Bruces, and not too far away over in was that Norway? The mainland area there. They gave a lot of monies and knights into the Templars, and they really enjoyed their relationship with the Templars. And of course, when they were excommunicated, the Templars, I mean, you have to understand, over in England, they were not arrested in England on English soil for several months later. Did they start trying to where that idea where because they weren't connected to the Catholic Church as much, right?
No.
So they had to. It was kind of a slower process getting them eradicated out of the England area. Some of the other areas that were around, of course, France, of course, they were on the warpath. Other areas did not. So it took a lot of other time later on
Mhm.
for the Templars to become persecuted in all these areas.
True. Well, it wasn't. It
Which, of
wasn't
course,
until
now you have the
Henry.
Bruce.
Well, but it
What's
wasn't
that?
until Henry VIII that they actually separated and created the Church of England. But the English had always
Right.
been bucking against that authority. But it also comes in the conversation of Scotland in the fact that we're basically talking about a French organization here with the Templars. I mean, we really are. We know many other Europeans joined them, sure, but this is a French organization, and how this French organization ended up in Scotland and all the things around it, I think, are incredibly interesting to me. But I don't want to belabor the point. But you should
Oh,
definitely
because of their
start.
mass, they were spread out everywhere by that point.
They
Yeah, they
were.
had
They
powers. They
were.
had
Yeah.
powers and temples and lodges, if you will, in so many different areas. At that point, yes, they were still the central power was still there in France and everything, because they came, the original Frenchmen started it up. But yeah, by the time you get to their excommunication, they were scattered everywhere, and you had these very powerful families, like you say, the Bruce. Now, the Bruce, he was going through, the Edward the Longshanks time frame. We know that he had problems with another political rival. He killed him. He stabbed him in the church.
Mhm.
The priests took him when it had bandaged this guy back up. Robert the Bruce went back to the church and killed him right on the altar,
Yeah.
which so he was
He's such a badass.
excommunicated. So you've got this man, you got this king who's excommunicated. His whole country, of course, is excommunicated. You've got the Templars then excommunicated right within the same year. And it's just a no-brainer for them who, like you said, they already had ties. They were excommunicated, and so many of them showed up there. And there's stories of when they were fighting the English later on in some other battles, where the English soldiers refused to go fight because they saw these horsemen show up in white mantles, and they said, "Wait, they've got Templars. We're not fighting. We're going home."
Yeah, no, very good. Yeah. But when we're talking about over in the Americas, because I'd like to shift over to that because I think it's very interesting. Of course, I have no direct correlation, but because we are talking about the Solomon's Temple and the things they found there, including maps. We do know that we do have documentation on the Western expeditions of Scotia and her searching lands, and she did a lot of stuff. But now the anthropologists will argue, saying, "Oh no, that she just found like Ireland or maybe Iceland, maybe Iceland." But it doesn't say that. It talks about her expeditions being long and far and traveling into the ice and finding new lands. Now, I would suggest that she might well have found a route on her expedition to the Americas, and that of course those maps and those ideas would have been in the Temple of Solomon, because it certainly would have been a highly respected member of their ancestry, right? So I'm suggesting that the maps that they found were not something akin to the Perry Reese stuff, but something more akin to the expeditions of Scotia herself.
Oh, okay. All right. Oh, neither here nor there. I can go along with that.
Okay, so tell them about America.
Well, you have 1,400 ships. You've got them connected to the Scots. We all know that on a much easier thing that we all talk about, right? Is was it Eric the Red, um, who went over to Vinland, the Vikings that were up in that area, who discovered Nova Scotia,
Hmm.
and
Yeah,
uh, and so if
news. Yeah,
the if the
exactly. Right. Yeah, go ahead. I'm
if
sorry. Go ahead. Yeah.
if the Templars were working with these guys, right? They would just very easily say, well, we're still excommunicated. We're going to go to the New Jerusalem, that this promised land that we know about, that's been promised to us, and we're going to go colonize over there. And of course, this is all while they're building the Roslin Chapel
Yeah.
in Scotland. We have to
True.
say Roslin Chapel at least once,
Yes, I agree. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what was it
So
built over? Anyway, sorry. Go
it a hill.
ahead.
so so the Templars end up going to America, and I think as far as conspiracy goes, there is a speculation, but there's not really conspiracy as far as tinfoil talk goes on what the Knight Templars did there, because even though we do find a few runes, we find some statues, we find some a few buildings constructed of stone that look like old forts.
Yeah.
It kind of draws to a halt as far as the conspiracy goes. Most of the conspiracies of the Templars then derive into concepts of the Illuminati, what they found, the Holy Grail, um, and whatnot. That was, of course, placed upon them more so by the French because of the Baphomet that they were talked about supposedly worshiping, and all these things, of course, lies that were drummed up to place upon them in order just to get rid of them out of jealousy.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. But it seems to me that they followed the same route that the Vikings had taken, right? And of course, the Vikings were supposedly following a route of maps and information they had, and of course, I don't know if this is direct connection, but I'll go ahead and make it anyway. The simple fact of the matter, a lot of people think the Norwegian or Scandinavian interaction with Britain was something that had taken place during the Anglo-Saxon invasions, and later the Danehold, and of course, as well as the Norman invasions. But actually, we have had Scandinavian people living in those areas, not centuries, millennia before this. And I do believe that there was a deep connection from those ancient times. In those ancient times, they had a certain knowledge of at least a map knowledge far greater than that was lost during the Dark Ages.
Yeah, yeah, they really did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
Well, I want to go back to that. I want to go back a little bit further though, because
okay.
we know that um, they were excommunicated and arrested, right, in 1300.
Yeah.
Reformation was 1500, right?
Yeah.
So very very early 1500. So you have just a 200-year stretch. So you've got um, 3 generations, depending upon lifespan, of people that now they had this information. They some of these people once again had lived with them, right? Like I said, they're blacksmiths, lived with them, understood what their version of Christianity was, and they're now populated out here in the
Hmm.
countryside. They of course they ran for their lives as well, and of course they all just kept going to church, but they had this knowledge of the Templars still. They were taught differently, and I think then that led to the ability for the Reformation to happen, because when Martin Luther pops up, and then he and Calvin, and when they come up with these new ideas saying, wait a second, hold on, Catholic Church, all of a sudden you got a lot of people behind them, and it was really quick. And I think that's because of the Templars themselves. They
Yeah.
had shared this knowledge, and this knowledge of course goes back to even today. When you tell someone, okay, you want to join us, you got to be pious, you got to walk the straight line, you got to do what's right as much as possible, and of course give up your riches, right, give up your some of your material wealth, and we're just going to decide how much you can have. It's going to be just live with the basics. What do you need anything else because you're now faithful?
Hmm.
People don't like that. They don't like it now. They rebel against that. And so if someone's telling you that and you're a king, you come up with all kinds of nasty things, and we know that other kings were adopting some of their concepts. They understood the power that the Templars had over their people, and so I think that's where the adoption of the concept of the Illuminati starts rising up, because we know that this eventually gets to the Freemasons, right? So we kind of have to lead there. That the adoption of some of their ways, because of the I wouldn't say absolute control over people. Like you can take the same thing that allows someone to have like the Templars, where they give people a reason for living, and they're working hard, versus because of a control that they do for them, a self control that you then give them, says, I understand their ways and I can control people through those same concepts of ritual. Lots of ritual involved, right? I mean, if you got to wake up at 4 o'clock and then you got to go to breakfast and someone's reading a book to you and you're all going to be quiet. I mean, they're very ritualistic,
Hmm.
you know, almost to a fault. If you take that same idea and then you want to put SS on someone's shoulder,
Hmm.
you got control of them, right? And we saw that fervor and fascism happen in the 1940s.
Sure. Well, and another point to kind of add on top of that, to add, power, credence to it, is the fact that when the edict came out, and of course, kill all Templars, a lot of the Templars were spread all across Europe. They weren't just in, as you'd already mentioned, and of course, a lot of them are coming of these new knights, these new whole noble families. So much of it had come out of these Knight Templars. What a lot of those guys did was they immediately swore fealty to the king or wherever they were, to protect themselves, right? So what happened was, with these kings now having all these new noble houses swearing fealty directly to them and not the church, 200 years later, where the Reformation came, this is where the rub was. The kings were like, well, why should we be under your authority? Why should we not just be our own authority? right? And of course, we also have the the Lutherans and stuff like that. As I get that's part of the conversation, but I think it's directly related to what happened with the Templars, because now these kings have so many new noble houses that are swearing fealty to them directly, giving them more power and less power to the Catholic Church, which thus brought on the Reformation. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, and there's something else happening here. In keeping this closer to conspiracy,
Yeah.
you have the Templars' brothers in arms, the Knights Hospitaller, and so they kept under the thumb of the Catholic Church. So they stayed nice and they played nice. They didn't have some of this other knowledge and stuff that the Templars had. But what happened was at that point that you had the Knights Hospitaller, the Knights of Malta, they were still working in the normal political fashions. When the Templars were disbanded, some of them, like you said, not only did they swear to these kings, they also swore back into the Knights of Malta and the Knights Hospitaller. And they end up sharing their information with them. And you see that pop up as well when you get into the more modern era of the Freemasons again.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Bullet says basically what happened to the samurai. Well, I get your comparison there. Although do keep in mind that samurai were a death cult, the Templars were not.
Whoa. Yeah. So everyone else has been quiet. And
They've been very
so
quiet.
at this point, it'd be nice to say, okay, this is tinfoil talk. So we
It
have to
is.
have we need Thundaro here, right, to throw something inflammatory out there.
Yes. Yes.
Getting back to that concept of conspiracy and what we've heard about the Templars and and those wild ideas. One of these guys need to bring something up. I think about that before we move completely forward into history.
Panel,
Anyone?
be useful.
Chat.
The
I
base.
got the chat going.
The chat has been basically talking about Krabbis for some reason. I don't know why.
Right. Well, you should talk about more about the sack of Constantinople. The Knight Templar did, which is securing the Silk Road, but they also built a massive cathedral in there as well, which is kind of interesting. So you always had the back and forth with the Muslims, but it was a powerful gateway, basically entry point to the Holy Lands. So when they lost that, they lost their path to Jerusalem and all that stuff. So that was a major point about that.
It's
And
a
I think
good
there's a
point,
lot of
Dinale,
history. Yeah, and there's a lot of history behind Constantinople as well. I don't know if you guys are familiar with it or not, but I do remember that.
Did you just ask if
That's
they're
it.
not familiar with some aspect of history leading? Yeah, okay.
To Constantinople. I'm talking.
Yes, no, I
Go ahead.
understand what you're saying. I think the point you're making is even more widespread than that.
Yeah.
We've been talking about the conspiracies around the Templars, and we haven't really
Mhm.
taken a lot of time to talk about what they did positively. And they actually did
Oh
build
yeah,
a
we
lot
did.
of things. There were a lot of structures and infrastructure and things that they put into the Middle East that was not there before. And I think that's an invaluable thing that they offered. And even though they didn't have access to those things after the fact, Denali, the Saracens continued using them though, right? So in a
Right.
way, the Templars actually lifted the culture of the Middle East quite a bit.
So maybe this is what I just thought of what I was looking for myself. The idea that the Templars wanted to, and we love this term, take over, right? The Illuminati, right?
Mm,
They want to take over. They wanted power, and they wanted to take over these different kingdoms and hold all the power for themselves. That is one of the biggest conspiracies, right?
Hmm.
sure.
Where do you actually see that happen though within their story? You see that when we finally get to Philip the Fair, right? So the Illuminati, the burgeoning Illuminati, is more of in the hands of King Philip the Fair. not the Templars who get blamed for the concept. Anyone? Chester?
No, I agree.
Aha.
Well, here's a question: what is the deity that the Knight Templars were accused of?
Baphomet.
Because
Baphomet.
Baphomet. So part of the issue that Philip had confessions from the torture session is that the Knight Templar that they were able to round up and have confession is they took Baphomet from Constantinople.
Oh, is
Well,
that where you're going with
I
that?
see
The
what he's doing.
Constantinople
Yeah,
thing?
no. Well,
Yeah.
yeah, okay,
Oh.
I get what you're saying. Well, the thing with Baphomet is, of course, Baphomet is just another euphemism for Apollyon or Apollo. And of course, if we go back to the worship of Mistra, which I had brought in the beginning, their one of their idols would be a Apollyon statue, of course, Baphomet. And so in essence, I think it's quite clear that they found a lot of Mistra stuff. I don't really know that I mean, I suppose some scholars would argue, but I think this is kind of accepted, which is why I said it initially earlier. So in a way, they kind of were at least protecting the ancient iconography. Sure.
Right, and where they built buildings and churches has been on top of former sacred grounds as well. I want to point that out
They did that a
as
lot.
well.
Yes, they did. The
So,
church has been doing that since its inception, dude.
so I wonder, we a lot of scholars and a lot of anthropologists are looking all over for these sacred hidden spot. But what if they're in plain sight? What if these temples that they've been built upon, are actually where the sites they need to be?
Oh yeah.
You know,
Yeah, no,
so
that's definitely true. We know when the Catholics came in to Europe, a lot of the old pagan things were built over. It's what they do. So I'm sure that's a fair point. And of course, as far as Constantinople goes, keep in mind that at the same time these crusades, the 3 centuries of these crusades, at the same time that's going on, you have Chinggis Khan banging on the eastern frontier. And of course, the Muslims by the end of it were suffering incredibly from the Mongol invasion, and a lot of them had been taken. That's where the Golden Horde comes from, right? That's a whole nother thing that's going on at the same time. And then within a century of the end of the Crusades and the end of the Templars, we also saw the fall of Constantinople to Islam, right? And of course, we have the French resistance, we have the Russian resistance, we have all these historical moments that dealt with dealing with the Muslims and pushing them back. It's definitely all related. And it's all coming out of mistakes that were made, and even the thing with the nobility becoming on the side of this new nobility coming on the side of the royals, and of course what brought us to the Reformation, which was coming out of all the same chaos, right? Because that first 500 years of this millennia or the last millennia were just pure chaos. It was ridiculous amounts of chaos, and then it all culminated in the Reformation, and of course 16 something or another when all that was going on. And at that time, the amount of bloodshed that had happened in before that in Europe was pretty bad. But then coming up to the Reformation, it was insane. You had literal cities on fire everywhere. And if we look at all the stuff that was going on around the world at the same time, we had just war and death everywhere. It was an incredibly incendiary time. And it seemed that after that 1600 period, things calmed down for a little bit. Right now, sure, we had the Revolutionary War, we had the America's actions in the Mediterranean, et cetera, et cetera. But it wasn't until the 20th century where we got into the Great World Wars that we saw that kind of carnage again. And it's all like a row of dominoes, I would say. It just started off with this one thing, and it just led into this just absolute disaster. You know what I mean? And Bullet is correct. He says, "Thanks, Obama." I agree. But yeah, does that answer the question?
Mm.
Wow.
Yes.
One of the aspects that, and I like to tie things together. Like, is there something else that relates? Because that's going to offer a little bit more validity to something else that's fantastical. And something that we have to understand is the Templars actually did bring over various customs from the Middle East. One of those, of course, was wearing a long beard.
Mm.
You know, like the Muslims do or did. And so just one of those ideas, because they did bring with them some concepts and some things from the Middle East, like Chester always says. And so
Absolutely.
if you
Yeah.
can compare that to some of their things, such as not shaving off their beard, then you can go along with the idea that maybe some of this other part, has some truth to it. But one of the things that does actually lack any additional evidence is the story of Baphomet, because this particular thing, and I think it's connected to other things like Moloch and whatever else, and that scholars have a problem finding out, trying to determine what Baphomet even was. Was it connected to this Jewish demon, or that Mithras, or whatever it is? There's nothing that really connects to it. Like, almost like it was invented by the French at that time and pieced together by different things. Like, one of those concepts is, because it's Baphomet, it could also be called Baphomet or Muhammad. So it goes back to Muhammad. So they're trying to alter some things and create a little secret Muhammad worship amongst the Templars, but you don't see anything else that points back to that.
Hmm. I
This
think it's
this
coming out of
creature,
Apollyon Batrome is where it's coming from.
this okay,
Yeah.
but that's it's a big stretch. Is my point there?
A little bit.
You,
Yeah.
you don't you don't see it anywhere else in the Legends of the Templars, or just all of a sudden at this one point in history, almost like it was fabricated. And when you start looking at details and clues, if things don't line up, come on, you kind of have to give it away and say it's not true. There's not enough evidence.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I mean, because we already mentioned how popular the Templars were. So, this action by the French king initiation, the initiating of the action, and of course the Pope backing him up, this certainly would have been the unpolitical thing to do. But they did it anyway. So, trying to find some way to, cascade some of the blame off themselves makes very good sense, I think. Dinale had made a comment earlier that I think connected maybe more closely to this than he realized. When we're talking about the Epstein situation today, it's quite obvious that the elite of our world were using his services, and once he became a threat, they removed him. Right now, I'm not going to compare that to the Templar because it's a much grander point, but it is similar action, and we see the elite of this world do these kind of things all the time. We've even been thrown into wars because of political people simply not wanting to have to deal with this situation, or usually money. But a lot of times we get thrown into situations that have nothing to do with what's being told to us, just like the nonsense of World War One and how that got started. It's quite common, I think. And although Epstein is a very small example, it's a viable one.
Mm. hmm Eric Hawkins in the chat brings up one of those conspiracies, one of those thoughts, one of those allegations, and that is that they were said to have worshipped the head of John the Baptist.
Mm,
Well, first off, worshiping the head of John the Baptist, mean that would basically make him a saint.
hmm.
Catholics were also known to worship saints, but I'm not going to go that direction.
Well,
I'm going to go the direction of burial practices,
ah,
because it's very interesting. Burial practices of that day, especially when a man would go overseas, right? And of course, you're not flying in a jet over there. It takes you a long time. So if these noble men would go overseas and they were in Jerusalem and they were fighting, if they got killed, oftentimes they'd take their remains and they would put them inside one of the little cave holes, the little tombs and whatnot. But they wouldn't leave them there forever. You see, when someone went back home, they would take their remains with them. But
it's true.
taking all their remains is difficult. So what they often did was they found the head and the largest bones available that was in that grouping, which is the thigh bones, and they would put them in a box. They would cross the thigh bones and put the head on top. Where we've seen this symbol before, and
Mm.
they wrap them up and then
Jolly
take them back
Roger.
home. The Jolly Roger, exactly.
Oh, now we're going to get into pirates. Yeah, baby. Go ahead. Go ahead.
So this is a burial practice because everyone wants to be, buried. The family wants them to come back home. So they take their head, they take their thigh bones, and they take them back to England, France, or wherever, and they inter those remains, and they consider that their new burial plot, not where everything else is still back in Israel. And so you can imagine, right, this idea now, that though it was commonplace, it's easy then to imagine what if one of these guys that you knew was special, right? Even Hugh DePayne's, maybe perhaps Hugh DePayne's when they had his head available, maybe they just kept it as a relic, right? So it's easy to come upon this idea that, and possibly even finding, like we even find the bones of people in tombs that they say is possibly, the tomb of the brother Jesus,
Mhm,
right?
mhm.
So if they found this, would they then think this was remarkable and then keep a hold of it? So now you've got this skull that they keep, and maybe they hold on to for a long time. They put in their temple. They put in the centralmost closet or holy or sacred place, intending to maybe take it to some place like Roslyn Chapel. I'll touch on to something that Chester's talking about, right? This temple of Scotia. I don't know, but it's very easy to imagine them wanting to inter something. Even if they do inter it, then they come around and say, "Wait, it's going to be lost. The Saracens are going to overrun." So instead of a holy grail, they take these remains, which they consider the core remains of a person, and they bring them with them. So I don't believe they were worshiping them,
Mhm.
so to speak, but I do believe it's possible they kept carrying head and thigh bones of something more ancient than them, while they are also carrying their own brother's remains with them
That's
in
right.
order to take them back to their homeland for
Mhm.
burial.
And do keep
Yeah,
in
but
mind.
you're
Oh, go ahead.
you're drawing a correlation to John the Baptist. This is really far fetch,
Oh, you want
though.
me? I can connect it. Would you like me to?
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, I will. Now, keep in mind that John the Baptist was beheaded by Herod. Herod was, of course, in charge of the Galilean temple. To understand, at that time, there was no Galilee, but there were the Galilee priests.
Oh my
And of
goodness.
course, he
I
would have
just
been in
realized where you're
charge of
going.
that. Now, hold on now. And therefore,
Oh
that would
my.
have been in Jerusalem itself. And Herod, of course, was a very important man. John the Baptist chastised him for divorcing his wife, and therefore, of course, I'm sure there were political reasons otherwise, but that was the official reason why he beheaded John the Baptist. But seeing as Herod is the one that had done it, and like I said, he was in charge of the Galilee temple, the Templars would have certainly got up in that and checked that out. And if they had found an area where John the Baptist's head was, they most certainly would have took that. He's a very important person to the Catholic Church.
His daughter wanted his head on a silver plate.
Yes, I understand that. Yeah,
Well, imagine. Well, okay, what happened to it then? It's
yeah,
possible they kept it
that's right.
around still. You know how you put a head up on a pike. Well, instead of on a pike, how about we keep it around on a silver platter or under glass for a while? Continuing to mock it. That's how much they disdain this guy, and who knows what happened to it at that point? And if they did find this head uh, buried in the bottom of a temple, it's very interesting. Or
Yeah,
the
no,
castle.
I think it's easily explained. It's not necessarily what they found, or even if they found the actual one. But if there is some connection to John the Baptist, it's not a very far stretch to see how they could have come upon that. Not at all.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Just like the
because
fingers, the fingers of Peter, the finger
yeah,
bones of the saints,
exactly.
and things like that. Yeah.
That's right. So I mean, it's interesting. I don't. The Templars, you have to keep in mind, in the 14th century, the Templars were accused of everything from demon worship to adultery and rape and insidious sodomy. And I mean, the campaign against them was pretty full on, dude. They
They
really
were the Trump of their day.
they were, yeah. But no, seriously, they went at him. They went at him hard, and it was because the problem they had. Of course, it's kind of a similar reaction had happened with Julius Caesar, actually. Now, there's no connection to our story here with Julius Caesar, but the people loved Julius, and when the senators murdered him, the people were in mourning for a long time. They were very displeased with what the senator had done because Julius was so popular, and the Templars were the same thing, and they were getting such a pushback from the people. This is when you come in with the Pope, basically, saying, "Yes, I bless this hatred of the Templars," and all the press that they were putting out at the time was really to deal with the backlash from the public, I think.
Hmm. Yeah, I agree.
And Eric says, Salome, wasn't that the daughter? I do believe so.
Hmm.
Yeah. But the official, I mean, the story of Salome is interesting one, and who knows, maybe it's true. But the official statement from Herod and the official is the fact that John the Baptist was chastising him for the divorce of his wife. And this is kind of where this is kind of the official statement of how it happened. The story of Salome herself and all that is a very interesting one, and who knows, maybe it's true. It doesn't really
Hmm.
matter. But
Yep.
being an important figure like that, if they came across that, I'm sure, or at least something was told that was that, they would have certainly grabbed that up immediately and probably took it back to the Vatican, I would assume.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. That totally is plausible. And so I teased pirates earlier.
Please.
Um,
Oh,
when
pirates.
when you've got this idea, right? You got the skull and the crossbones. I somewhere it became kind of, I guess, notorious that that they used this practice. Matter of fact, um, I would say that it's possible what that they used that concept in the actual um, trials themselves, right? The fact that you're worshiping this head, this skull and crossbones. What can you tell us about this, right? And so when you have the King Philip, who was, as Eric says, up to debt in his eyeballs, it's true. He was trying to go and have more wars and whatnot, so he kept borrowing money. They told him no, and so when he had them all arrested, he had them arrested and everything. These I think it's somewhere around 1,400 ships depart the docks. Well, all these Templars and their ships and their crews. You have to imagine not every crewman on board of these ships is a Templar himself, but they're under the control of a Templar knight.
Mhm.
They turned around and they didn't have anything. They had no port that could be their own, except maybe some in Scotland. So it became very easy for them to turn around and say, "Wait a second, the Catholic Church is what threw their hat in with King Philip, and we don't owe any allegiance to them anymore. Matter of fact, we own our allegiance straight to Christ Himself. We don't need them anymore. And since they have riches and gold and they're corrupt, why don't we just take some of that back?"
Mhm.
And the church ships, the church had their own ships, right? The church ships were pirated in great numbers
They were.
through at this point throughout the 1300s. And what this flag they flew was it was in mocking of them, right? So they put this skull and crossbones. So some scholarly research types believe they put this skull and crossbones as a flag and flew it in defiance, letting the church know this is who is raiding you, and we are your pirates. We're now sinking your ship. Well, not sinking your ships. We're with cannons and we're now attacking your ships, taking food, gold, and what we need to survive since you run us off. And that's where you see the Jolly Roger in that time frame start to come about, being used as
That's right.
piracy, because you actually don't see it in other areas. Every group of pirates, Redbeard and Longbeard and whatnot, they had their own flag. I think one of them is a skeleton with a sword poking into a heart,
Yeah.
right? So they all had this flag that recognized them as who they were, So to let people know, this is a pirate, and it's that pirate, and he's known for this, that, and the other. They were doing the same thing. They were saying we're pirates of the skull and crossbones of what you had tried us for,
Mhm.
and this is what we're going to do. And so stand down lest we kill you because we're better fighters than you, right?
That's right. And that tradition does come out of Britannia. And of course, we're talking about the Templars being in Scotland. The simple fact of the matter was what it became is traditionally a symbol of the Shadow War, right? And that's what it was. And of course, we know going forward into history, you had the privateer, which was an officially hired ship of the line, usually to go out and deal with bandits or whatever rebellion, what have you. But the pirate itself, we know, are coming up out of the Shadow War. They were kind of like the CIA of the time. A lot of people misunderstand that, but the most famous pirates in history, all of them were politically connected. They were very wealthy people. They weren't poor. They were very rich. They outfitted their own damn ships, and they were connected to this Shadow War, and that symbol of the skull and crossbones. Although by later times, of course, DeWolf is very correct. They would take their own flags. The skull and crossbones became a symbol of this shadow war of what the Templars had done after the fact. And of course, we see it connecting further into today. We have, of course, the Skull and Bones group, which several presidents, including the Bushes, were a member of, and Clinton as well, I believe. And they're carrying on that Masonic tradition, right? And once again, we've made a few allusions here to the idea that the modern day Masonry is coming straight up out of what the Templar study and Templar understanding, uh, at least superficially. Although I think it's much deeper than that. It's not a speculation. I think it's straight up exactly what happened, dude.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah,
Um. Uh, anyone before we move on from that? Anyone else got anything else? Because actually, we're getting near the end of the show,
we are.
so we don't want to jump forward into the anything
No,
else.
I think we're good.
Yeah. Well, we did kind of cover the Masons and stuff, which, but I think there is a direct connection. I guess the question, first thing I would say from Eric, where Eric here said, watch out for kings named Philip, huh? I mean, all the way from Macedonia up, dude. If you got a king, his name Philip, he's a bad dude. I guess the question I'd ask before we wrap it up is to DeWolf is, do you believe that the connection to modern day masonry is with the Templars? Is it superficial or is it direct?
Wow. You use the term direct.
Mm,
Um. I would actually say it's not superficial. Um. Direct. I see. I was going to use the word indirect, but I think it is. I think it's more direct.
yeah, I think so too.
There was. I think there was a couple of like branching offs. There was even a schism at one time, but I think you can continue to follow the trail from certain groups of Masons today back to the Scottish Rite, back through the uh, the Templars, and I think, of course, I think if you follow that knowledge all the way back through the Templars, you're following it all the way back to Egypt and to the sons of Adam and Eve themselves.
Yeah. And Joseph White here says, where does the Satanism, paganism fall into Skull and Bones Club if they are Templars? Well, dude, I think that people have a real, it's Hollywood has a big hand in this, and I think there's a reason for it. I do believe there is propaganda involved because the Masons and even the Skull and Bones, these are not evil organizations. They work for charity. They work for enterprise. They work for the betterment of society in general. Right now, are there some bad Masons or some bad Skull and Bone members? I'm sure there are, but in general, they're not what Hollywood has portrayed them to be. You have to understand this, and of course, and DeWolf could speak on this a lot deeper because he is a Mason. But you have to understand that Hollywood, somehow or another, has got itself connected with the Saturnists. And the Saturnists are evil bastards. They follow the rituals with the Key of Solomon and all that kind of crazy, crazy, insane stuff, right? And that's why you're seeing all this pedophilia and nonsense coming out of these Hollywood people and these other types of elites that are connected to them. But understand that those Saturnists are not connected to Masons or Skull and Bones or whatever the other Scottish Rite or whatever. They're not connected. Matter of fact, they're in opposition. So the fact that you see so many movies putting this, conspiracy on Masons and stuff makes perfect sense to me because they consider them to be a threat, right?
Yeah, and to answer this question a little more directly, you've got Roslyn Chapel that's built. You've got, and at that point, they had their secrets before, but now they're even more secret. Now they're, like you said, shadow war.
Yeah.
But the Templars changed their names. They were in the Knights Hospitaller, the Knights Malta.
Hmm.
They're in various organizations and
That's right.
places. They were still working. Some of them were still working together. They're working in Scotland, but they're also going over to the Americas, like you said.
Hmm.
Okay, so they're hiding out, and they're also adopting themselves into other areas, and they're continuing to pass on a little bit of who they were with each other. But at this point, now you got people when they rise again, when you see the Reformation happen, and then the guilds and the lodges pop up, which
Yeah.
were no longer the masons of stonework, but the masons of the soul, basically, who are now continuing this idea that man has an inner light,
Hmm.
and where the Templars had Christ to develop that. These other guys, they went clandestine, they went underground, they did their own thing. It took, like I said, another 300 years passing on this information, and it popped up in what's known as Masonry, um, which was in parallel, I believe, with the Reformation.
I
You had
think
other
so too.
people that looked at
Yeah.
you had other people that looked into the symbolism of what was going on, how they kept their secrecy, because other people like the Bavarian Illuminati,
Yes.
they took their ideas and they tried to cause a revolt directly against the king and the religious people leaders in the Bavarian area,
Sure.
right?
But
And they were demonized as well.
yeah, but they're
And
not Templars, dude. They're coming out of the Medici banking practices, and it's different.
right, right, the Bavarian Illuminati twisted it to their whims to try to get a group of people riled up and give them what they thought was a secret society type concept so
Mm.
that they could help them revolt against these leaders. That idea continues on to this day. So if I can take something that's good that people get behind, and I twist some of these ideas to my own whims, I can then start a cult. You see that with Branch Davidians, right?
Yeah.
You see
Yeah.
that with the Kool-Aid Man. I'm not going to stress my brain coming up with his name.
Jones.
Yes, thank you. You come up with that concept. So there's always a twisting of things that work, especially religion, for their own purposes. And I think that's what you see here with Satanism and paganism getting involved in
Mhm.
Templar concepts, Mason concepts, and things like that. And some of it's just for your own personal, fun.
Yeah.
We see that in some of the Masonic appendant bodies. Some of it's just to have some social interaction with other people.
That's true. But then again, we know that our founders were all Masons, and people are going to throw all these kind of negative, secret, evil stuff on top of the Masons. But yet, look
That's
at
a
the
joke.
wonderful thing. I know, right? But look at the amazing things they did. Look what they did. They sacrificed their own potential power for the betterment of a country that could truly be liberal, liberated, and free. Right? That's what they did. Those dudes gave up the potential to be kings in order for a country that could stand on its own for the people by the people. And you're
Yep.
gonna say Masons are evil after the sacrifice those guys gave? Are you kidding me?
Preach on, brother.
Well, I mean, come on.
It's
Um,
nice to hear someone ever say that, because all the conspiracies talk about them being Masons, all the secrets and the symbols and everything about the roadways and stuff, and about how it's designed to be satanic. And while they're creating a country where people can be free and do what they want, is and not not have control of power, because we know Satan wants power.
Yeah.
So that's anathema in thought to the two concepts.
Yeah, well, there is a lot of symbology in the structures they built, but so what? What does that
Yeah,
mean?
yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, it sounds like you and I could go on for hours at this, but we don't have hours. So let me come
You
over
think?
to the other panelists. Todd, you got something to add before we get out of here, dude?
I don't know if there's anything to add. You guys covered everything. Jesus.
You can say you
And
don't believe any
Jesus.
of it.
Yeah, but
No, I believe all of it.
wasn't it interesting though?
Oh, very. No, dude, it was like I was in class and you guys were the teachers.
Sweet.
And that's, sometimes that happens. You guys are just, heads and tails above the rest of us when it comes to the knowledge and the range of it on these subjects.
Oh, well, it
I'm
is
willing to
interesting
admit that.
too, especially with Todd and I. We agree on a lot, obviously, as you guys can see. We disagree on a few interesting points, but it doesn't matter. I have a fun conversation with Todd for sure. Yeah, thank you,
I
George.
don't know why he would ever disagree with you, though. Jesus, I don't disagree with you.
Well, no, he makes good points.
Yes, she does. I'm joking.
George, what do you got to say, dude?
A couple of things. One is you didn't address how they propagated their numbers, other than just recruitment. Everything you've said speaks to a central intelligence
Mhm.
or central coordination, and that wasn't touched upon.
Oh no,
The
Todd DeWolf did touch on that. He did cover that. What he said, what he told you was the fact that when the papal bull came out, and you could thus join and become knighted. This is an opportunity. I think maybe he should give you a primer on what it was like to be a peasant. Maybe if you understood what it was to be a peasant at the time, and then all of a sudden the church is saying you could become a knight. This is it's hard for a modern person to understand the importance of that, I think.
Oh yeah, but everything you've said so far, both of you, it speaks to quite a range of missions
Mm,
that they underwent. Well, that
Yeah.
over generations, that kind of
yes.
thing, it just it doesn't happen unless there's a central authority or central head that's actually pushing this forward. As an example, China always works on a 100-year plan on anything it does. Islam, the strategy of Islam is similar. It works on a long-term plan strategy, and there is a central figurehead within Islam. There's a central figurehead within China. I'm not talking about the spiritual figureheads. I'm talking about the real world figureheads. What was the figurehead within the Knights Templar that actually span generations?
Oh well.
Because apparently the church has come and gone. Kings have come
Well,
and
yeah.
gone.
The figurehead
Everyone's
itself.
backstabbing each other.
Right. The figurehead itself would be Christ then. The cross, the red cross on the white banner is their central figurehead.
Polsek, I have to stop you there. Regardless of that's a symbol. That symbol is not telling them, okay, you know what? I want you to go over there and do this mission. I want you to go over there and do that mission.
Okay,
Money,
yes.
George.
So, but
Money.
you asked what was bigger than that. So underneath the head of Christ, they had the Grand Master of all Templars, and of course under him was the master of a temple, of every temple in any wherever they were at. And then of course, going along with that, they actually had someone who'd be the treasurer, someone who kept the books, right? And going on down the line, there was an organization, and this organization continued. And there's a well-known list of grandmasters going down from Hugh de Paynes all the way to Jacques de Molay.
Sure. Yeah, but
Yeah.
it also comes down to money, George. Because once you join the Templars and become knighted, you have an opportunity to be granted lands, right?
Yes and no.
Well, I think this might have
They
been a
actually
driving
had
force behind a lot of the peasantry joining up, right? Money.
They had
opportunity.
officers basically and enlisted. If you were a peasant type of person and you were joining, you would not get the white mantle and cross. You would get a brown mantle, and you had to work your way up through the ranks. And
But you
you were
could though.
basically like our current military. You had officers and enlisted. I suppose you could, yeah. Over time, you would eventually. But if you were just a regular guy and you wanted to join, you had to join from the ground up, and you had to work a lot more so than someone who kind of sort of bought their way in.
That's true. But I get what your question is, George, and I think religious fervor is certainly a fair point from DeWolf's point of view. But I think it has a lot to do with money and opportunity. I just think these people who had nothing saw a chance to maybe get something. I think that was the
Well, they had a
real,
mission.
and it's a
Their
mission.
first mission was to keep the Holy Land safe for pilgrims. That was their first mission, and then they kept getting missions, and those missions came from, the guy on top, for the most part, and sometimes it was bad. There's a very well known uh, commander, grandmaster that I think he was a very bad one. He's the one that led them off into the battle in which they were all dehydrated, and Saladin killed off all the Templars and many others of the nearly all the armies in the region at that time, and the Templars were a part of that. And I think that particular grandmaster was a bad one.
Yeah, and
It
you had
happens.
some other leaders who did questionable things. I mean, a lot of people have the idea that Templars murdered everything in front of them. That's not true. Now, there were examples of certain Templar commanders going into towns and stuff and literally just killing everybody, right?
Yeah.
And of course, also the first taking of Jerusalem, they say the blood in the streetway were up to the thresholds. I mean, there are some examples of some pretty horrific and brutal action by the Templars, but then there's examples of constraint as well.
Hmm.
So uh, good question though, George. What about you, Dinale? You got something?
Nope, I am good.
Awesome. Well, the chat has a lot of interesting questions about Krabbis and aliens, and something about golden dongs. I don't know how that came into. I guess it's the sword and sheath ratio. I don't know, but interesting. You guys are way off topic. Way off topic. But nevertheless, thank you all for coming. We do appreciate it. We love doing TFT. This is fun. It's interesting to just sit and talk and speculate and kind of get into it. Sometimes our subjects are easier for the panelists to jump in on, and it's something like this, which is historical. It can be limited, but that's okay. But it's very interesting to have you guys here. We'll try to pick something next week that's more universal, so we can have more of the panelists have opinion. But before we let Dinale take us out of here, I'm going to go ahead and let DeWolf have his closing statements.
Goodness, I don't think I need any other closing statements at this point. Tune in, keep tuning in. Check out what TFT is going to do, because you never know when you're going to have some conversations like this,
Mm.
and or we're going to go off on completely different areas and find out what aliens and stars and the wavelength of light has to do with the dark matter.
Ooh, yeah, yeah.
So, you know,
Yeah, and
so
definitely
that's
if you want, go
that's
ahead.
about it. Yeah, yeah. Thank you. That's about the biggest thing I can say. Yeah, thank you to the panel in the chat and everybody involved. Very very fun show to do.
I think so. It was a good conversation today. And keep in mind, as DeWolf was just mentioning, if you want to come in here and be part of the conversation, dude, just hit up my Twitter. We'd be happy to have you come in and give your opinion on it, right? And don't be shy about it. You don't have to be the most knowledgeable person. Just come and give your little sliver of it. Here on this show, we do a little bit differently. We have people put together their own presentation, right? So you just put up your little thing you want to talk about. It could be just one singular point, and we'll talk about it, right? Come in and be part of it, and also give us ideas and of things we can talk about here on TFT. I think it's inexhaustible, but and we of course will repeat ourselves in certain nuanced ways from here time to time. We did today a little bit, but I think it's great fun, and I definitely would would love to see more of you guys come and get involved in it. But nevertheless, we appreciate you guys. Do keep in mind that tomorrow we have the California show Comics News Today, which is at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, to give a little extra time for the Californians to come in. See, we even love our liberal brothers, right? Dinale, take us out of here, man.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us for this TFT show. Join us tomorrow at 9 p.m. for Comics News Today. And as always, your perception shapes your reality. So always make it a good one.
Namaste.
Namaste.
Gesundheit.
Later guys.
Aloha.